It's not that something different is seen, but that one sees differently, wrote psychoanalyst Carl Jung. And what did he mean by that? It's not that something different is seen, but that one sees differently. Jung was talking about cultivating perspective, perhaps one of the most important things we can learn. And in this program, my fifth in the series, entitled, What Are the Most Important Things We Can Learn in Life?, I'll focus on what famous thinkers in philosophy and psychology and religion and literature have said about perspective. What is perspective? Perspective is the ability to see things in their relative importance. Again, perspective is the ability to see things in their relative importance. We often talk about seeing the trees but not the forest, and that if one can see the forest and not just the trees, one has perspective. Perspective also involves distinguishing between the transient and the enduring, or the permanent, the fundamental. And perspective involves understanding the fundamental facts of our existence. Let's contrast for a moment the difference between the transient and the enduring. Where do we find the transient? Well, I think it's fair to say that when we read the newspapers and watch television, usually what we're focusing our attention on is something that is passing, something that is not enduring. For example, some years ago, the public's attention was focused on the O.J. Simpson case, and then the Monica Lewinsky story, the Jean Benet story, Martha Stewart, the Janet Jackson Super Bowl episode, and Michael Jackson's legal troubles. One wonders which famous person is next in terms of occupying the press's attention and television's attention. One of the important questions I think we can ask ourselves is, what is to be learned by focusing on the transient? Is there a better way to use our time? And perhaps the most important question we can ask ourselves concerning the transient is this: is there any personal growth in focusing our attention on such things? In contrast to the transient is the enduring, or the timeless, as some would phrase it. And where does one go to find information about the timeless? Well, I think it's fair to say that one of the places one goes is to good books, good music, and good art. And also, religions at their best. Religions at their best deal with the timeless. And philosophy at its best. And also, we can access the timeless through quiet sitting and through observing nature, among other ways. What might be the value of focusing our attention on the enduring, on the timeless? I think it's fair to say that one of the ways in which we can profit from doing this is that as a result we can experience personal growth. Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, commented on people's propensity for focusing on the trivial. And he said this. He said, "I believe the mind can be permanently profaned by the habit of attending to trivial things, so that all our thoughts are tinged with triviality." And Kierkegaard, on a similar note, said this. Kierkegaard, of course, was a famous Danish philosopher. He said that most men tranquilize themselves with the trivial. Perspective involves determining what's really important in life. Perspective involves finding out what's satisfying to one's soul. Again, is reading about scandal in celebrities' lives, and watching movies featuring car chases and fires and shootouts, and even being news junkies, which some of us are. Is that satisfying to our soul? Perspective involves developing insights, which raises the question, what should be the goal of acquiring knowledge? What should be the goal of acquiring knowledge? Well, the great thinkers are pretty much agreed that the goal of acquiring knowledge is not mere information, but insight. Schopenhauer put it best. He said, Information is merely a means to insight. I wish to give an example of something that I think illustrates this very well. I believe studying history is a good example of what I'm talking about, and helps us to illustrate the difference between accumulating information and developing insights. When we study history, of course, we must learn facts and dates. It's quite important. Can be boring, but it's quite important. But of course, if that's all we do, then we really aren't good history students. Good history students jump the gap from memorizing to thinking. And what they do when they think is to develop insights. For example, one of the things we can learn from history is about human nature. What is human nature? Tolstoy, I think, put it best. Tolstoy gave the best explanation I have ever read of the purpose of history. Tolstoy, in War and Peace, comments, and I'm quoting him, "The aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves." Again, Tolstoy on history. The aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves. I recall when I was in high school, we used a history textbook with the very appropriate title, The Record of Mankind. After all, that's what history is, the record of mankind. And let me give some details to again illustrate my point. If one is studying the Industrial Revolution, or imperialism, or slavery, or the U.S. Constitution, one of the important questions one can ask oneself in studying these topics is, what do they tell us about human nature? Allow me to give you an example. Allow me to give you an example of a possible insight I think that one can derive from studying history. And this is an insight relating to human nature. I think it's fair to say that one of history's lessons is that many people, maybe most, at least unconsciously, crave power over other people. Again, I think one of the lessons of history, and so many historians and psychiatrists have mentioned this, is that perhaps one of the lessons of history is that many, if not most people, perhaps at least unconsciously, crave power over other people. What might be some specific examples? Well, in talking about individuals in history, we could talk about monarchs and dictators, people like Saddam Hussein, who had a passion for exercising power over people. But we could also talk about nations being interested in having power over other nations. We know that so many of the powerful countries in the world, including the United States and Germany and France and Japan, at one time sought power over other countries, sought to control other countries, and indeed did control other countries. Another example, I think, that history shows us is the questing of men for power over women. And of course, history shows us that so often white people have sought power over black people. And also that different ethnic groups have sought power over other ethnic groups. We saw this in the Balkans, and perhaps one of the problems that we are experiencing in Iraq now, and perhaps will unfortunately continue to experience, is infighting among the various ethnic groups in Iraq. And I think the U.S. Constitution, our Constitution, illustrates the idea that most, if not all people, perhaps, are interested in power. After all, one of the fundamental principles of our Constitution is the separation of powers. The idea is that our founding fathers, the people who wrote our Constitution, was very aware, these people were very aware of the idea that many people want power to use selfishly, and therefore they try to construct a government that would minimize the potential for abusing power, and hence our separation of powers into the presidency, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. Many psychologists and psychiatrists and philosophers have also commented on people's propensity for power, and even have tried to seek the reasons for this. Psychiatrist Alfred Adler said that the reason people seek power very often is due to their feelings of inferiority. Adler believed that almost all people if not all people, have some feelings of inferiority, and they look to compensate for those feelings. Adler said this in a very powerful sentence concerning inferiority and power. He said this, and I'm quoting Adler: "The goal of superiority, of power, of the conquest of others, is the goal which directs the activities of most human beings." And Tolstoy, the famous Russian novelist whom I quoted before, Tolstoy said this: "What men considered sacred and important were their devices for wielding power over their fellow men." Why might this insight be important, this idea that people seek power over other people? Well, for each of us individually, I think it's important, because it can remind us that perhaps at times we are on power trips. And if we are, we should be conscious of that and the potential harm to our relationships that our power trips involve. And also, as citizens, it's very important that we be aware of any attempt by anybody in our government to exercise undue power. It's been said that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And also, it's important that we be aware of other people's power trips and perhaps their attempts to exercise power over us. It could be friends, it could be neighbors, it could even be family members. And of course, to be reminded of the destructive effects that people exercising power over other people, at least attempting to do, can have. So far, I've focused really on a kind of negative insight concerning human nature. Let me for a moment try to balance the equation by talking about some positive insights concerning human nature. Pascal, the famous French intellectual and mathematician, said this. He said there are two natures in us, the one good, the other bad. Again, the one good, the other bad. And so many philosophers and men of letters and religionists throughout history have commented on this, that there are probably two natures in us, one negative and one positive. Nietzsche also had something positive to say about how we can use power. Nietzsche, the famous German philosopher, suggested that the best way to use what he claimed was our instinct for power was to establish power over ourselves. He said that people who are the most wise are people who are interested not in exercising power over other people, but in exercising power over themselves. For example, in being better able to control their emotions. And perhaps my favorite quote on power comes from the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, very famous minister who was very active in the civil rights movement years ago. Reverend William Sloane Coffin said this. He said, "There are two ways to be powerful. There are two ways to be powerful. One is to have power. The other is not to need it." Let's compare Tolstoy's view of history with the TV program Jeopardy! My guess is most of you have seen that program. You recall that Tolstoy said the aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves. Well, Jeopardy! And Tolstoy together both raise the question, who is the best history student? Who is the best history student? I think if one watches Jeopardy! One might get the impression that the best history student is the person who knows the most facts and dates. The person who knows the most facts and dates. No insights required. Whereas, if one believes in Tolstoy's version of history and its purpose, I think one would conclude that the best history student is that person who has learned the most about human nature and life from studying history, and who is able to apply that knowledge to his or her daily living. That requires insight. What else does perspective involve? Well, perspective also involves an attempt to find something positive in a negative experience. All of us regularly have positive and negative experiences, And if we can find some positive element in our negative experiences, perhaps that can not only be a learning experience, but can perhaps make life more satisfying. There is a story, I think, that illustrates this idea. It's a story entitled "The Horse That Ran Away." In this story, a farmer informs his neighbor that his only horse has run away, and the neighbor says, "What a terrible thing." And the farmer says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" And the neighbor is kind of astonished at the answer. The farmer later informs the neighbor that his horse has come back and brought several other horses with him, wild horses. And the neighbor says, "That's terrific." And the farmer again says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" The neighbor is somewhat astonished. And then the farmer points out that his son tried to mount one of the wild horses to tame it, and in so doing fell off and broke his leg. And again the neighbor says, "How terrible." And the farmer again says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" The neighbor again is astonished. And then the farmer points out that the government had come around conscripting an army, and they wanted to put his son in the army, but when they found out his son had a broken leg, they didn't. Hence the name of the story, "Who Knows What's Good or Bad?" Thoreau provides some illumination here also on this idea of finding something positive, in a negative experience. Thoreau said, "If we will be quiet and ready enough, we shall find some compensation in every disappointment." And Emerson, Thoreau's mentor, commented on failure and the fact that even when we fail in life, there can be positive elements involved. Emerson said this, and I'm quoting him, "Failure is a part of success. A man's success is made up of failures because he ventures and experiments every day." The idea is we haven't really failed. We haven't really failed if we learn something from our failures. How does one develop perspective? How does one develop the ability to see the big picture, to see the forest and not the trees? Well, I think it's fair to say that the main way we do it, at least the great thinkers say the main way we do it, is by evaluating our experiences. And if we can evaluate, then we can learn. I think it's accurate to say that some elderly people have wisdom and some elderly people don't have wisdom. And what might be the difference between those who have wisdom and those who don't? I suggest to you that one of the differences is that those who are wise have habitually evaluated their experiences and learned from them, so they're not making the same mistakes they made years ago. And of course, another obvious way to develop perspective is to study, to learn, to observe, to reflect. And in this respect, good books, music, good movies, good conversation can all be helpful. The great thinkers also claim that suffering plays an important part in our life in terms of helping us to see more clearly. Pascal, the very famous French thinker whom I quoted before, he said this, and I'm quoting him, "1 hour's pain is a better teacher than all the philosophers put together." And I think that what Pascal is saying in this quote, among other things, is that suffering can jolt us. Suffering can jolt us into remember what is really important in life. That suffering is a reminder of the fragility of life and also of good health. Another thing we can do to develop perspective, and my guess is that most Americans and perhaps most people in the world don't want to do this, but the great thinkers say it is very helpful, and that is to think about impermanence and death, to make it a habit of thinking about impermanence, and death. The famous Buddhist thinker, Sogyal Rinpoche, commented on this, and he said this, whenever we lose our perspective, reflecting on death and impermanence shakes us back into the truth. It's also important, if we're going to develop perspective, that we develop an attitude of skepticism, and we should be especially skeptical of people who claim to have certainty. I'll say that again. I think it's especially important, and the great thinkers say this, that we be skeptical of people who claim to have certainty. Unfortunately, there are few things in this world about which we can be certain. Voltaire, the French intellectual of the 18th century, put it this way. Voltaire said, "It is only charlatans who are certain. Doubt is not a very agreeable state, but certainty is a ridiculous one." Again, doubt is not a very agreeable state, but certainty is a ridiculous one. And historian Will Durant has indicated that history shows that certainty can be murderous. Durant points out that so many people and groups in history, when they thought they were certain, did horrible things to other people. And he and other historians have pointed to things like the religious inquisitions in history, whereby some fanatically religious people who were certain of their beliefs burned other people to death simply because these other people didn't share their beliefs. And also we know that there have been so many religious wars in history. France and Germany, for example, experienced religious wars, Catholics killing Protestants, Protestants killing Catholics, all because they were certain God was on their side, and each group was certain that truth was on their side. And also, in recent generations, we have experienced the fanaticism of some communists who were certain that they had the path to utopia. And because these communists were so certain they had truth, they proceeded to try to suppress, and indeed did suppress, dissent through torture and murdering other people. Gordon Allport, a famous psychologist who taught at Harvard years ago, said that we cannot use our full intelligence unless we doubt. We cannot use our full intelligence unless we doubt. And Allport, in his famous and sympathetic book about religion, says this. He says that there really are two kinds of religious believers. There are mature believers and immature believers. And Professor Allport says that mature religious believers are people who believe but yet aren't certain. They have doubts. And also because they have doubts, they're willing to consider evidence that might run counter to their beliefs. Whereas psychologist Allport says that immature religious believers are certain of their beliefs, they refuse to have any doubts, and will not consider any evidence that runs counter to their beliefs. In this context, theologian Paul Tillich, one of the most famous American theologians, said this: "Doubt is the necessary tool of knowledge." Doubt is the necessary tool of knowledge. Let me bring this together with some summary comments that might help us to think more clearly about some of the things I've pointed out in this program. First of all, what might be some of the results of cultivating perspective? Well, I think it's fair to say that when one cultivates perspective, one changes. In fact, I think it's fair to say that change is the end result of all true learning. Change is the end result of all true learning. And you recall that Carl Jung said that it's not that something different is seen, but that one sees differently. You know, Jesus also commented on this. In Luke 6, Jesus commented on people who see the speck in their neighbor's eye, but don't see the log in their own eye. And Jesus suggested that one take the log out of one's own eye, and then one will be able to see clearly enough to take the speck out of one's neighbor's eye. How might perspective help us in dealing with daily problems? I think it's fair to say that perspective teaches us that there is rarely a perfect solution to our problems. In fact, Carl Jung said that the serious problems of life generally have no complete solution. But yet, problems have a purpose and a meaning. Let me give you Jung's own words, and I'm quoting him. "The serious problems in life are never fully solved. The meaning and purpose of a problem seem to lie not in its solution, but in our working it out incessantly. This alone preserves us from stultification and petrification." The Dalai Lama has said that we should remember that life is a succession of problems, and also that we should remember that virtually every path we take in life has advantages and disadvantages. Indeed, there is a Chinese proverb that says every gain in life involves a loss, and every loss in life involves a gain. I think it has also been accurately said that life can be a balancing act. Life can be a balancing act in which we balance one interest against another. And what might be the best guiding principle? Well, perhaps the best guiding principle is to try to habitually do what's best for one's soul. Some final thoughts. The Buddha claimed that the root of all suffering is the grasping for control. That he says that we often suffer because we wish to control elements of life that we can't control. The Tao Te Ching, a very famous Chinese book, says that if we wish to acquire wisdom, we should learn to go with the flow, not cut against the grain, not swim against the tide. And finally, theologian Reinhold Niebuhr composed the Serenity Prayer, my favorite prayer, and I'll close with it. Niebuhr said, "God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can change, and the wisdom to know the difference between what can be changed and what can't be changed." And finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we should all be artists in life. In Walden, he wrote, "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."